I'm really excited to join everyone today and talk about climate change and land use change impacts on pollinators. I'll be talking about this is what I did my PhD research on, and I'll be talking about bees and some of the cool stuff that I was able to find out over the last couple of years. I'll be sharing just a little bit about bees and biodiversity more generally as well. And really excitingly, I think at the end of the talk, I'll share a little bit of things that you can do to help save bees and biodiversity more generally. And I'll also touch on something that I started more recently, which is my work with Wildlife Conservation Society Canada on the Key Biodiversity Area program. So I'm really excited about that work, and I'll touch on it a little bit at the end as well. So I'll be talking about a lot of things today, and I realize that the dry technical name that I have for this talk was maybe a little too specific almost for what I hope to talk about. And so I changed the title a little bit to something a little more a little more accurate, I think, which is what I'm going to talk about saving the bees and the rest of the planet. So I'm really excited to share all of that with you today. And just as a note, I'm coming in from Ottawa, Canada today on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, and really excited to join everyone. I'll have a couple of challenges as well scattered out throughout the talk. So pay attention to those, and I hope that you accomplish them at some point after. But without further ado, I guess I'll jump into the topic of conversation today. I think there's no better way to start off talking about how to save the planet than by looking at the planet. And oh my God, like it's such a beautiful planet that we live on. This blue dot is full of such amazing things, such amazing diversity and nature, from landscapes to wildlife, and from big things to small things. I don't swim very well, so the blue parts of the planet are a little foreign to me, a little more mysterious, and I'll keep it that way. But the green parts and the brown parts across our planet are full of, I think, the most wonderful things. And to dive in a little bit in this biodiversity, I think there's a couple of incredible landscapes that I think we'll start with, but one that I'll jump into now is savannas and other sort of plains. This is just one example of the type of incredible diversity and type of landscape that is booming with this type of biodiversity across our planet. If you've ever had the privilege and the chance to visit one of these savannas across Africa, it's absolutely stunning. And the first thing you'll notice is how many things there are across these types of landscapes. Here, of course, we're drawn to these herds of elephants, but there's an incredible diversity and amount of different species of big animals that are across these plains as well, that you'll inevitably run into if you spend more than a couple of minutes in these landscapes. Things like herds of zebra or gazelle, other ungulates, big predators, things like lions or leopards, hyenas. And then, of course, that's just kind of the big animal diversity. There's a whole bunch of big plant diversity that we'll see there as well. In this photo, we're immediately drawn to these towering trees. But if we look at the smaller things in the landscape, these clumps of grass, for example, there's an incredible diversity here as well. And this isn't something that's often as exciting or features as often in expensive documentaries or shows, but the diversity in little clumps of grass, I think, is astounding as well. In a little clump here, for example, you might find dozens of different species of grass and different plants. And if you look at the things on those grass and plants, you'll find, without a doubt, an even higher diversity of little invertebrates, from beetles to flies to even bees and other pollinators, which we'll talk about a lot more later in the talk. But this diversity of things is, I think, just astounding. And the fact that when we look at different levels, we find, just this diversity exploding is something that I think is just absolutely stunning. And one of the things that I love about the planet that we live on, and one of the things that drives me to help protect it as a conservation biologist. Of course, in the sea as well, this diversity is equally high. And there's so many places that are just full and bursting of life. Where I grew up in Northern Ontario in Canada, the diversity is not quite as high as in the tropics, but we have, I think, an incredible selection of plants and animals and other diversity as well here that I think often goes underappreciated. In Northern Ontario and Canada and across a lot of the US, You'll be familiar with some of the big megafauna that we have in these sort of temperate and forested landscapes. Things like moose, things like bear or deer. These are some of the big megafauna that we're drawn to often and that spring to mind when we think of wildlife in our backyards. But of course, there's a huge selection of other types of animals and other types of species that are around us almost all the time as well. Birds, reptiles, and turtles, smaller mammals like raccoons or skunks or other things, and of course, invertebrates, insects like damselflies, which are amazingly colorful and some of my favorite things to watch in the summer, and of course, bees and other pollinators. In the middle left side of this little collage, we'll have a green metallic sweat bee, one of my favorite types of bees to see in the summer, and one that you'll see across similar species across North America. And of course, this represents the main topic, or one part of the main topic that I'll talk about today, bees, the thing that a lot of you are probably here for today for to hear about. And bees, of course, are part of a group of pollinators, which is also incredibly diverse. Pollinators include everything from bumblebees, like we have a couple of pictures here in this collage. Other pollinators are things like butterflies, moths. Flies are actually incredible and often underappreciated pollinators as well. Flies like syrphid flies, hoverflies, bee flies, and there's a whole, as a little bit of a tangent, there's a whole incredible selection and diversity of wild and wacky flies that often go completely under our radar, but that are incredible pollinators as well. And of course, things like birds, and in a lot of different parts of the US and in southern North America, bats and other animals are often important pollinators as well. But the diversity among these pollinators is incredible. For the purposes, I could go on, all day for probably many days about the cool things that we know about pollinators. And so for the purposes of the rest of the talk, I'll stick to one group of pollinators in particular, which are bees. And my PhD research, where I focused on how climate change and other human impacts were affecting pollinators, focused a lot on bees, in particular bumblebees. But bumblebees aren't the only bees. I mentioned metallic sweat bees earlier, and you can see them again here, but there's a huge selection of other bees as well that are sometimes much different from the archetypal or stereotypical bee that we might have in our heads. In the lower right-hand portion of this picture, you can see a little honeybee across a yellow coneflower, I believe. And the honeybee is often the first type of bee that we think of when we think of bees. Honeybees are managed bees. The bees that we use in North America, the honeybees that we use in North America, are actually European honeybees. And so they're actually very similar to farm animals in a lot of respects because we manage them, they live in managed hives, and they don't do too well in the wild on their own outside of these managed hives. Very important for our agriculture, but incredibly different and unique compared to the huge selection of wild pollinators, wild bees that we have in our backyards. These are things like leafcutter bees or miner bees, these metallic sweat bees, nomad bees, which come in these dark reds, or cuckoo bees, which can also be these amazing colors, and of course, bumblebees. The diversity of bees is amazing, and I think it deserves, to appreciate it, you kind of have to see some of the numbers and see those in context. Worldwide, if we were to look at all the different species of bee that we have, there are over 20,000, or about 20,000 different species of bee. And honeybees and bumblebees are just a small fraction of that. In the US alone, there are about 3,600 different species of bee, and honeybees and bumblebees are just about 50 of those different species. A lot of those other species completely fly in the face of what we think of when we think of a bee. A lot of the, like miner bees, leafcutter bees, green sweat bees. I mentioned some of these already, but these make up the bulk of the different species of bee that we have. And they come in all sorts of different sizes and shapes, from insanely huge Patagonian bumblebees. These you won't find in the US, they're found in South America, but they can get up to 4 centimeters long, which is absolutely massive. They're in these bright orange colors, they're super fuzzy, and they're commonly called the flying mouse because of how big and how loud they are, which I think is absolutely incredible. Other bees can come in incredibly small sizes. In the very middle of this picture, you'll see this small yellow bee. This bee is typically only a few millimeters long. It's an Australian minute bee. And different bees in this group of species are insanely small and stand in a really stark contrast to these bigger bumblebees that we're more familiar with. And of course, the colors and shapes that these bees come in are, like I hinted at before, very different from the typical red or yellow and black bee that we usually think of in our head when we think of bees. The diversity in this group of species is insane, which is what I'm trying to get at. And it's not just the diversity of shapes and colors, it's the diversity of lifestyles as well. We often think of bees as living in hives, being very social animals, but in fact, most bees are solitary. They live on their own. A lot of bees dig holes in the ground or live in colonies under the surface of the earth. Some bees, like leafcutter bees, will chop up pieces of plants and use them to create little apartments for their larvae to grow up in, that they stock with food and eventually emerge from the next year. Some bees even take over or retrofit snail shells as their houses. So there's an incredible diversity of lifestyles of bees and an incredible beauty in all of this, I think. And it just, adds to the diversity of the earth in its entirety. And it just blows my mind to think about. And I hope it blows yours too. Of course, like most of us know, a lot of this diversity across the planet in bees and wildlife more broadly is eroding. A lot of the human activities that we're doing are causing species to disappear from huge portions of where they used to live. And it's causing communities to become less and less diverse over time. This is caused by a lot of things, but a couple of the big culprits are habitat loss. This is one of the biggest drivers of the disappearance of species and wildlife across the globe. And I think it's immediately obvious when we see pictures like this of how converting landscapes from wild places and natural places, meadows or forests or whatever type of habitat, into human-dominated landscapes, I think it's obvious a lot of the time how that can be detrimental for species. It destroys habitat for them to nest in, for them to eat in, for them to reproduce in. And even when we're, not going from a forest to a parking lot, these types of land use conversions or land use changes can have really big impacts. For bumblebees, for example, or for other bees, one of the things we see often is that even though agricultural fields for some parts of the year have a huge amount of floral resources or flowers for bees and pollinators to visit, the resources in these human-dominated landscapes are much different from the types of resources that we'll see in natural landscapes. To give an example, a meadow will have flowers that are blooming year-round, from the beginning of the spring until the end of the fall. In an agricultural field, you might have a huge amount of floral resources, but these will usually only bloom at a small portion of the year. And so for huge parts of the year, this field, which used to be a meadow, which used to be bursting with life all year round, will be a desert for bees for a lot of the year. So there's, even for pollinators that sometimes are less impacted by some of the human activities and human landscapes that we convert things into, the effect on them can be huge as well. And this is something I'll talk about a little more in a bit later in the talk as well. Pollution is another huge factor driving the disappearance of species across the globe. When we see pictures like this of plastic pollution and other types of really obvious and jarring pollution, again, I think it's pretty obvious that this isn't good for species. When we think about bees and other pollinators, one of the types of pollution that we often think of is in terms of pesticides. Pesticides are really good at killing bugs and really good at killing pests in particular. And so they're really important for a lot of our agricultural fields and produce and agro systems. But just as pesticides kill bad bugs very well, they also kill good bugs very well too. And so when we use pesticides indiscriminately, when we're not careful about how we apply them and which pesticides we're applying, we can end up having really big impacts on pollinators like bees and in the surrounding landscapes of agricultural systems more generally. And the final big threat that I'll touch on today, and something that I'll talk about a lot more later on, is climate change. We all know, have an idea of what climate change is and how it's caused by human activities and other such things. And one of the things we know about climate change, or that we're often told, is how it results in this global warming. of summers getting warmer and warmer, winters getting warmer and warmer every year. But one of the things that I want to introduce now, and something that I'll touch on later today as well, is the idea of climate chaos that climate change brings. This is the idea of how climate change makes extreme events, extreme weather events, worse and more common over time. Things like droughts, things like heat waves are becoming more intense and becoming more and more common and lasting longer as a result of climate change. This means like things like wildfires are becoming worse and are becoming more common, and a whole suite of other knock-on effects mean that climate change and the chaos that it brings are having really detrimental effects on species across the globe, including pollinators. Of course, these three big threats aren't just facing pollinators, they're facing basically all life on Earth, from humans to the big things in our landscapes to the smaller things in our landscapes as well. And this is, devastating, I think, regardless of what it's impacting. But for things like pollinators, like butterflies, bees, birds, things that we saw earlier, this is particularly worrying because of the big role that these pollinators play in our landscapes. I mentioned that for my PhD research, I focused a lot on bumblebees, and bumblebees are some really important pollinators that we have in North America. As a little reminder, pollination is the transfer of pollen between flowers. I'm sure a lot of you know this, but I'll go through a quick refresher just in case. And so pollination is the transfer of pollen between flowers, more specifically between one part of a flower to another part of a flower. A lot of plants can do this on their own, and some rely on just creating a boatload of pollen and just throwing it up into the wind. And they rely on what we call wind pollination. A lot of trees and a lot of grasses do this. And if you have seasonal allergies or pollen allergies, then you know exactly what type of process they rely on. They create a lot of pollen, and by sheer chance, some of it will land on another plant, another flower of the same species, and end up pollinating that flower. Without this transfer of pollen, plants can't produce fruit, they can't produce seeds, and they can't make new plants. And so this is really necessary for them. Most plants can't do it on their own, and most plants don't rely on the wind. Most plants need help with this pollination, and so pollinators like bees and butterflies and moths and bats and birds help them transfer this pollen. Plants will attract them with things like nectar, and as they visit flower to flower, these pollinators will transfer the pollen from different parts of the flower to different parts of different flowers entirely. It's a very effective process. It helps a lot of plants. And even if plants can do pollination by themselves or rely on wind, a lot of them still benefit from animals pollinating, transferring pollen flower to flower. You can imagine with numbers like this, 75 to 95% of flowering plants need help with pollination. Pollinators are really critical in our wild landscapes. Without pollinators, the wild places that we visit or recreate in, or walk by on our way to work or school or wherever, these wild landscapes would fall apart. Pollinators are the glue in a lot of ways that hold these landscapes together. And they're also really important for us humans in a more practical sense as well. A lot of the foods that we eat rely on pollinators. Commonly, we hear that 1 out of every 3 bites of food is there because of pollinators. And overwhelmingly, that bite of food is the delicious and nutritious and tasty things that we eat on our plates. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, berries. These are the things that rely on animal pollination. And so without animal pollinators like bees and others, we would miss out on a lot of the color on our plates and honestly in our lives as well. I mentioned that bumblebees are really important pollinators, and this is true for a couple of different reasons. In North America, bumblebees are probably the best pollinators that we have. They're thick, they're fuzzy. I like to think of bumblebees as the teddy bears of the sky because of the way they bumble from flower to flower. And because they're big, because of their fuzzy, they're really good at pollinating throughout huge lengths of the year in North America, especially where I live in Canada or northern temperate landscapes. Bumblebees are often the first pollinators or among the first pollinators that come out in the spring. And now that we're getting into the fall, bumblebees are usually some of the last pollinators that you'll see out pollinating in this season as well. So they really pollinate a huge range of flowers across the year, which is, as we can imagine, really important for these wild landscapes. because bees are so big, they can also do a really particular type of pollination called buzz pollination. This is something that's really important for a lot of plants. Tomatoes in particular rely on this buzz pollination, which means that they need a big pollinator like a bumblebee to actually physically dislodge the pollen from the flower of this plant. A smaller pollinator like a honeybee or a fly or a butterfly won't be able to knock off the pollen from a tomato plant or from another plant that relies on buzz pollination. And so only bumblebees can do this and achieve that transfer of pollen from flower to flower. So they're really important in a lot of respects in our landscapes. But unfortunately, bumblebees are disappearing across North America and Europe. This was what I found in my PhD research. I used these huge data sets collected by museum collectors and researchers and community scientists and citizens and naturalists. And I looked at how communities and species of bumblebee were changing across 120 years in North America and Europe. Basically, I looked at how bees were found, where we found bees across the regions that they lived, and looked at where they were disappearing from certain places, where they were establishing into new areas. And I looked at how communities of bumblebees were changing in the number and types of species that we were finding where. I was able to relate this to changes in climate, to changes in how humans were using land in terms of the availability of natural habitats. And what I found was that one of the main things that was driving the disappearance of bees across North America and Europe was climate change. This was one of the biggest factors that was able to predict whether bees were going to increase or whether they were going to disappear or establish into new places. And in particular, what I found, or what the research that I did suggested, was that it was not only the gradual warming that climate change caused that was driving these changes, but also the extremes and the chaos that climate change was causing as well. I mentioned that this chaos and these extreme events like droughts and heat waves were becoming more and more common because of climate change. And the research that I did suggested that the way that these forced bees to experience temperatures that were greater than they've ever had to experience before in some regions, I found that this was really devastating for them and was driving a lot of disappearances of species across North America and Europe. This is something that I think makes a lot of sense, because we know that, even though average temperatures every year are getting warmer and warmer, you or I or a bee doesn't experience average temperatures. We experience day-to-day temperatures. And so there's extremes, a 1 week or a 2 week heat wave in the middle of the summer is a lot more devastating. It can have a huge impact on an organism, especially like a bee, which only lives for about a year in most cases. These extreme events can have a big impact. And even though as a result of climate change with gradual warming, we expect that species should be able to move, as regions in the southern parts of where they live or the equatorward parts of where they live get too hot for bees, we expect that them or other animals will be able to move northward, as in the poleward regions of where they live, temperatures become more suitable for them. Extreme events and the idea of this climate chaos means that that doesn't necessarily happen, or that picture at least isn't as simple as we used to think. Of course, climate change and climate chaos wasn't the only thing that I found driving disappearances of bumblebees across North America and Europe. I also found things like habitat loss were really important. And of course, things like the intensification of how we use land, and especially application of pesticides, can play a huge role as well. And this is what a lot of other researchers have found too, is that the intensification of how we use land can have a really big impact on bees and other pollinators too. So as beautiful as bumblebees are, and as important as they are for our landscapes, they're facing a lot of threats from different directions. And bees aren't the only animals facing these threats. All three of these things, climate change, climate chaos, habitat loss, and land use intensification, the intensity that we use land, is affecting virtually every species on our big, beautiful planet. And if we don't do something about it, then this is going to slowly and, well, pretty quickly actually now, erode a lot of the diversity that we see across the planet. The beautiful diversity that we saw, that we looked at just a little bit earlier, could disappear if we don't do anything about it. This is where I'm going to transition from talking about pollinators and diversity to talking a little bit about what we can do to save this planet, to save the bees from things like climate change, things like habitat loss, and save the rest of the planet too while we're at it. These are all really big threats, and so there are no easy answers that I'm going to be able to give you today. If we want to address the root causes of a lot of the things impacting species like bees, we're going to have to do a lot. Reducing our human footprint is something that's really important at an individual level, but it's not enough to reduce your individual human footprint. The biggest individual action that you can do to help address climate change and help prevent habitat loss and other big impacts on species is voting. This is something huge. Decision makers play a huge role in deciding the fate of the planet. And so it's really important to use that vote well and to vote for decision makers and politicians or other representatives who are going to stand up for the environment and address climate change. And that's not to downplay the importance of or the benefit of other individual actions, but voting is by far the biggest individual action that you can take. And so I mentioned I was going to have a couple of challenges throughout this talk, and the first challenge is coming up now, and that's to spend about 10 minutes at some point today after this talk researching the representatives of your area and their positions and plans on the environment and climate change. There might not be an election coming up anytime soon where you are, but it's good to stay informed about these things and to think about them early. So just take 10 minutes, nothing more, nothing less, and spend a little bit of time looking at who the people are in your area that really care about climate change and that can make a difference at different levels of government. And of course, even better, if you have a little more time, you can write to them and let them know that this is something that's really important to you, and this is something that you believe that they should do something about. Some of those, I mentioned that individual actions can make a big difference as well, and they're also a lot of fun too. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some other actions that you can take that will make a big difference for pollinators and bees and for conservation more generally. The first big thing that you can do, and one of my favorite activities to do just, generally on my free time, is contributing to community science. Community science is the idea of bringing people who maybe didn't study about science or maybe didn't spend a lot of time in school, or maybe who did and just have a lot of free time that they want to spend outside looking for cool things. Community science is a way to engage with science in a way that will help other scientists do their work and help develop solutions and research to help species. One of the funnest community science activities that I like to take part in is just apps like iNaturalist, eButterfly, or eBird. These are programs or apps that, you go outside, you take pictures of cool things that you find in your backyard or on a hike or on vacation, and you can upload them to these apps. And these observations of species that you take, these observations of whatever you find, get uploaded to these databases. They get checked by experts or other knowledgeable people about species. And then they can actually get sent to researchers and scientists to use in their research or in their conservation activities. In my PhD research, I used information from community science apps like iNaturalist or Bumble Bee Watch. And in the work that I'm doing now with Wildlife Conservation Society Canada in identifying key biodiversity areas, I use a lot of this community science from iNaturalist as well. So spending some time finding species, whether you're outdoors or not, well, I'll be honest, I'm doing this a lot of the time anyway, but sending these pictures to apps like iNaturalist or eButterfly, contributing to these community science programs really does help the conservation of species. Researchers use this to figure out how species are moving or changing in response to climate change or other human impacts. And researchers use these to develop better conservation solutions to help these species as well. So this is an incredibly fun and incredibly important individual action you can take as well. And this is where my second challenge for today is going to come up, which is, if you don't already have iNaturalist or iNaturalist Seek, download it today and find 5 different species. This is a pretty low bar. It's pretty easy to find 5 species, even from your bedroom window or from your kitchen window. And so I challenge you to do this today. You might not even have to leave your house, honestly, to find 5 different species. Um, but these are some of the best apps that I know for community science like this. They can even identify species for you. And so it's a really exciting way to have an excuse to go outside and to be able to look and learn about different species and different animals around you. So I challenge you today to do those, to do this challenge and find a couple of different species today. The next activity, the next thing that you can do to help save bees, and this is going to help bees really specifically and other pollinators as well, is making a pollinator garden. This is a really fun activity. You might do this already, but it's something that can make a big difference for pollinators in a really local sense. And this will help everything from bees to butterflies to hummingbirds and a whole range of other different pollinators as well. Pollinator gardens can provide not only food and resources for bees and other pollinators, but if you make them properly and purposefully, you can also use these pollinator gardens to help bees cope with changing climates and extreme weather events as well. So making a pollinator garden is pretty easy, but there are a couple of key things to keep in mind as you're doing it. The first is to plant native local wildflowers. It's really important that your pollinator garden mimics the nature around you as closely as possible. And so planting wildflowers that are native to your region, wherever it is across North America or the rest of the world, is a really important thing so that to make sure that the resources that you're providing for pollinators are the same ones that they would find in the wild near you as well. And native plant nurseries in your region are also really great resources for figuring out what will grow in your garden. That's native and will be helpful for pollinators. The other really important thing to consider when you're making a pollinator garden or planting a pollinator garden is making it natural. Nature is pretty messy. It's not ordered and it's not carefully designed in the sense of a lot of gardens. And so a pollinator garden, it's important that it be the same sort of way. It's fall, of course, leaves are starting to fall from the trees. And think about if you're making a pollinator garden or if you're interested in helping pollinators, think about leaving some of those leaves on the ground in the fall instead of raking them up. A lot of pollinators like bees or butterflies or others use these fallen leaves to overwinter. They crawl inside, they spend the winter there a little insulated from the surrounding snow and cold. And so if you can leave some of these leaves, at least in a portion of your yard or pollinator garden, undisturbed, this will be some great habitat and really important habitat for pollinators and other bees. And when it comes to the spring and the snows start to melt and you start to see these leaves again, think about leaving them again undisturbed for a couple of weeks to allow pollinators the time to slowly emerge at their own pace from these overwintering spots that they might have made. In a similar sense of, in a similar idea of leaving your gardens wild and making them wild, think about adding different elements of structure into your garden as well. This could be things like leaving a fallen log on the ground or in a portion of it, leaving bundles of sticks or twigs that get collected over time, and having a diversity of taller shrubs, smaller bushes, and different types of plants and flowers around the garden. This is good because it gives a good diversity of places for bees and other pollinators to visit. It gives them a diversity of places to forage, a diversity of places to nest in, and a diversity of places to spend the winter. A lot of bees and pollinators overwinter in a diversity of these different habitats. And so giving them a good selection is a great way to give them a lot of habitat to choose from. As well, these types of structures create little microhabitats or microclimates even that bees can use and other pollinators can use to shelter from extreme events. When things get really hot, when things get really dry, pollinators can use these little structures, like crawling into the heart of a bush where it will be very shaded for most of the day. Pollinators can use these small microhabitats to shelter from these extreme events, and that'll help them weather the storm of climate change. So making your garden natural, making it wild, is a really helpful thing that you can do for your pollinator gardens. And this is going to lead to my third challenge, my last challenge of today, which is to plan out your pollinator garden. You might have one already, and that's awesome. If you don't have one, I'm not saying you have to make one. I'm just saying to think about if you were going to make a pollinator garden, where would you put it? What would you grow in it? How would you design it to be, natural and messy and good for bees in that sort of way, in a lot of different ways? This is a really fun activity to do, especially in the heart of the winter when there's like 4 feet of snow outside, and it's minus 20 degrees Celsius out. Thinking about, a beautiful, lush, green, colorful pollinator garden is an awesome way to kind of escape for the winter. So I definitely encourage you to take a little time, maybe not today or maybe not this week, but over the next couple of months to do that before the spring. So this kind of it's been a real blast talking about pollinators and diversity today. I'm going to open it up for questions, but before I do that, I'm going to talk for a little bit about some of the work that I'm doing with Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. Because I'm really excited about the work that I'm doing with them for key biodiversity areas. And it touches on something that I've been mentioning a lot already today, which is biodiversity and kind of the amazing wild things that we see, both big and small, across the spaces that we live. Key biodiversity areas are these places across the country. In Canada, we're identifying them across the nation. And they're sites that can be big or small, but that contain important natural things or important natural areas for different pieces of diversity. These can be really big in the north of Canada, along Hudson Bay, for example. We have a lot of really big sites where thousands and thousands of birds will congregate to breed or to feed or to nest. And in other places of the country, we have very small sites, some of them in the middle of cities that just have the particular conditions, environmental conditions to sustain a really endangered plant species, for example, or a really endangered beetle or some small piece of biodiversity. So these places can be big, they can be small, but all of them are incredibly special, incredibly unique. And as somebody who likes nature and loves being outdoors and seeing some of this diversity, all of these places are incredibly exciting, incredibly special. The key biodiversity areas, or the KBAs, are based on this international standard, which is used across the world. And all of these areas are defined in a really quantitative and a really scientific and rigorous way, either based on the species in them, whether it's threatened species, rare species, or whether these places are really important for the biological processes of a species, for example, nesting or breeding or migration. But these areas can also be defined based on ecosystems as well. A lot of the areas that we've identified in Canada are really pristine areas where ecologically there's a huge amount of integrity. They're untouched, and the ecosystem functions within them are incredibly well preserved. And other of these places are just absolutely irreplaceable. All of these sites, it's not easy identifying these sites. We have a huge team of people that's doing it at Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. We're leading a lot of the work with our partners at Birds Canada and NatureServe Canada. But there's a huge, dozens of different partners that we have as well at different conservation NGOs, different Indigenous organizations, and at different levels of provincial and territorial government that are helping us do this work as well. And there's an even larger network of experts, of species experts and regional experts that are helping us to identify these areas as well. It's a really collaborative process, and it's a really cool one to be a part of. The work is pretty far underway in Canada, and pretty soon will be coming to the US. I think NatureServe is bringing this process as well to the United States soon. And it's a really exciting one to be a part of. If you're a species expert or an expert of a site or a place that you think is really special, I'd really encourage you to reach out and find out more about this program. In Canada so far, we have identified almost 700 of these really special, really unique places across Canada. A lot of these places have been identified for birds because of important bird areas, which are a pretty common other type of designation, all meet the same criteria for KBAs. But a lot of these places are, you can see from this map, some are massive, some are really small. A lot of them have been identified for species that we usually get overlooked in terms of conservation a lot. Small emerald dragonflies, for example, hunting spiders or bog spiders. A lot of the animals that we usually overlook when we think of conservation and of what species we should protect are getting picked up in this search for important places. And I think that's really exciting, really cool. And it means that in almost every city where people live, there's a site pretty close to them that is incredibly special, that has a really high significance, either nationally or even internationally as well. A lot of these places that we're identifying need to be protected, but a lot of them don't. And I think that's what's really cool about this project as well, is that we're seeing the bright spots of conservation, the places where, because of thousands of years of stewardship or because of a lot of close caretaking by different people in the region, things are going very well. And these places are really important for biodiversity, really important for species, and that doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon. So it's really cool to find these special places in this sort of sense as well. And identifying these areas, these key biodiversity areas, doesn't mean anything it doesn't mean that they'll be protected. It doesn't mean that people can't access the land. It doesn't mean that they can't do what they were doing already. Collecting this information is just collecting information. But what's really cool is what we can do with this information. In Canada, the government is really keen on using these key biodiversity areas to prioritize where they'll put protected areas and what sort of land they should acquire and stuff like that. Businesses are interested in using this information to see where they should invest to help offset some of the harm that they might cause in other places. And people, me personally as well, are really excited to identify these areas because a lot of them are right next door, are right around the corner, are right nearby. And especially in an era of COVID where we've been confined so locally to our different regions, it's really exciting to be able to find that, just an hour's drive away from you is this really important site containing something that is found nowhere else in the world or nowhere else in the country. So for a lot of reasons, it's really exciting to be working on identifying these areas. And I just wanted to share a little bit about that. If you'd like to find out more, I definitely encourage you to check out kbacanada.org and some of the work that we're doing, or reach out to me if you're interested in chatting about it more. And like I said, if you're an expert of a species or of a place that you think is really special or that you know is really special, reach out and we'd love to get your expertise into our system as well and hear from you to see what sort of key biodiversity areas are around the country. So on that note, I'm going to open it up for questions, and I'll just circle quickly back to those 3 challenges that I asked beforehand. I really encourage you to do these at some point, maybe today or later in the week or in the next coming months. It would be awesome if you took the time to do it. But either way, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure to be here. And thank you to everyone at Xerxes for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Peter. We do have questions coming in. So the first question, are there or do you have any maps or graphs on how much climate change or land cover change is impacting pollinators?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And as part of my PhD research, I didn't go super into the technical details, but I was able to make, one of the cool things I did during my research was developed a tool to help us predict how climate change had impacted species over the last 120 years. If you reach out to me, I'm happy to share that map. It's in some of the published research that I've done, but it was really cool to be able to point out where over the last, especially over the last 50 years, climate change, the effects of it have been really visible. And so it was really cool to be able to point out where climate change has caused a lot of species to disappear and where climate change has also benefited a couple of species. And so we could point out, the bright spots, or not only the dark spots in places where things are going bad, but also the bright spots where things are still going okay, where species are still coping very well. So we do have a couple of these maps. Last summer, I was also able to work with the California EPA to kind of do a more California-specific version of that. And so it's exciting to be able to use these tools that I developed in my research and that help predict the impacts of climate change and land use change to actually inform what we do and where we know the risks are for bees.
All right, thank you. This next question is asking about how the iNaturalist data is used, and they're specifically referencing how Bumblebee Watch is verified by experts whereas iNaturalist, they do not believe is, and wondering how you address this difference.
Yeah, that's a really great question as well. And something that's really fun to ask, because the data collected by community science is only as good as the people verifying it. And so for apps like Bumblebee Watch and eButterfly, for example, you're very right. Like those are reviewed by experts. Every single observation is checked by an expert. For iNaturalist, that's not really the case. It's checked by those observations, and iNaturalist are checked by the community. Oftentimes, there are a lot of species experts, like world-renowned species experts, that are on iNaturalist and that are verifying observations. But that's not the case at all. It's not always true at all. And so we have to use those information. We have to just view them differently, or view them with a little more critical eye. It doesn't mean that they're not useful. It doesn't mean that they're not helpful. It just means that when we use them, we need to take a more critical eye on it. In the work that I'm doing for key biodiversity areas, for example, we use all of the information that's from iNaturalist, all the research grade information. And so we consider that whenever we look at these observations. We think about, okay, is this going to be verified? If it's in a really weird place, we'll think more critically about maybe it's not worth using. But I'll say that I've done some research on how we can use community science inside research, and the information overwhelmingly is very helpful. The information collected in apps like iNaturalist, even though it doesn't get verified, or even though we have to take a more critical eye, can tell us a lot of new things relative to just expert information or expert collected information about where species are and what they're doing in a changing world. But that's a really good question. Thank you.
Thank you. We have quite the diversity of questions this morning. It's great for this afternoon. This person is asking, they had a huge problem with ants in their house, and they finally hired a company to come spray. And they said that the chemicals that they affected, or the chemicals that the company used, they said didn't affect the good quote unquote bugs, but they're concerned that that might not be true. Any suggestions? I'm sure a lot of people have this question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll be honest, I'm struggling a little bit to answer it, but let me do my best attempt. I guess what I'll say is that, I mentioned this in the talk as well, but pesticides are really good at killing bugs. And so they're really good at getting rid of bad bugs, but they do kill good bugs as well. There are very, very, very few pesticides that are specific enough to kill just a single bug. I'm not even sure that exists, I'll be honest. What we can do, though, is use pesticides in a very specific way. We can apply them in a way that minimizes the chance of other good insects, or insects we term beneficial, coming in contact with those pesticides. So there's a big difference, for example, from laying down pesticides in very specific corners of the house, I don't know, where ants are meant to go, versus just spraying them throughout the house and letting them waft out the windows into the garden, into the yard, and whatever. So I don't know your case specifically, and I'm not sure I'd be able to offer a very helpful answer in terms of that. But I will offer that as an example of the way that we apply pesticides, even though often pesticides affect good bugs from bees and others just as much as they affect more pest bugs. The way that we apply them can be very purposeful and can minimize a lot of impacts on those more beneficial insects.
Yeah, I think you answered that well. I think it's hard when using any pesticides that we recommend just to not use them. But yeah, I think those are good recommendations. Thank you, Peter. This person asking, we have a couple questions about KBAs. Are the US and other countries identifying KBAs? And can you just remind our audience what KBAs are? Yeah,
definitely. So these KBAs, these key biodiversity areas, are important natural places. If we want to get the technical definition of them, is sites that contribute to the persistence of biodiversity. And so basically they're sites that hold some element of biodiversity that is unique, nationally or internationally. That can be because of threatened species, because of rare species in the area. It can be because the site is really important for migration of a species or another biological process, or it can be because the site contains an ecosystem that is found nowhere else. In Canada, for example, we have these alvar landscapes, these like limestone plains that look like concrete. They're natural concrete almost in the middle of these meadows. And they're really like fascinating to see. And they contain a lot of rare species. And so these ecosystems are really important and probably a lot of key biodiversity areas as well. So the idea of these places is that they're important. They're important to highlight, to know where they are, so we can plan appropriately in terms of land management, in terms of where protected areas are, et cetera. And a lot of countries are right now taking the steps and going through the process of identifying them in a comprehensive way. Canada is one of the countries that's doing that. And so we're about a year and a half, 2 years underway of identifying these areas across the country. And we've gone pretty far. It's really exciting. There are a couple of other countries across the world that are doing this as well. Australia is underway. South Africa is underway. Mozambique, I believe, as well is on the way to identifying them, and a handful of others. And pretty soon the U.S. will as well. NatureServe is planning to bring this program to the U.S. as well, and start identifying these as well. So if you're interested, I'd recommend, I guess, reaching out to NatureServe. I don't know exactly who's doing that there, but you can always reach out to me as well, because all of these national bodies identifying these KPAs talk fairly frequently. So I'm happy to chat more about that and how you might be able to get involved.
We do have a few people asking for a link for your published work on bumblebee species and possibly your thesis as well. I don't know if you can either share that in the chat now, or if you send it to me after the webinar, I can include it in the email that goes out automatically after this.
Yeah, I'm happy to share it afterwards for sure.
Okay. Thank you. We do have a question about bumblebee houses and if there's any research that's been done on the man-made bumblebee houses. This person has a bumblebee nest in one of their birdhouses and has recognized research that's done on the orchard mason bee houses show that they can spread pathogens and are more frequently occupied by non-native species.
Yeah, I think wasps as well are often use these bumblebee hives or beehive kind of solitary bee houses or bee hotels just as often as bees. So it's a tough balance, I guess, as to how helpful they are for wild pollinators, or how much kind of harm they do versus benefit. I'm not sure. I don't think I have a good answer for that, and I don't know that one exists, because there's a lot of different evidence going around, and I don't know that anyone's done a really comprehensive study to pull it all together. I know one of the things you can do is maintaining these places really well, maintaining these hives very well. So, example for those bee hotels, cleaning them out every year is one good way to help reduce the pathogens that might be spread through them as well. So there are different ways that you can do this carefully and to maintain them well. But in general, I think it's hard to tell, and it's hard to tell how good a job you're doing or how bad a job you're doing, because you're not a bee, and it's unlikely you could identify all the species that are using this in different ways. So I'd say, if you like it, if it's there and bees are just using it, there's probably no need to remove it or to make it impossible for them to use it. But if you're actively trying to help wild pollinators, then probably the best thing you can do is to make a pollinator garden instead of a bee hotel, or instead of introducing a managed hive or a managed bee house or something for them. Wild pollinator gardens, let the pollinators come to them, and I think that's probably the best thing you can do if you want to actively help wild pollinators.
Right, thank you. So back to a map question or databases. Are there any databases that show local land use changes?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there are. It very much depends on where you are. At different scales, there's different levels of information available. So in the analysis that I did, for example, because I was looking across 2 different continents, I needed a global data set of how land use has changed, how humans have used land differently. And so I used the history database of the global environment, the HYDE data set, HYDE for short. And so that database goes back actually thousands of years. And it's, kind of predicted land use from BC, even from like 1000 BC or 10,000 BC, and predicts how humans have used land across the globe at a pretty coarse scale. And I was able to use this for the last 120 years. And it gave us a pretty good idea of how land use has changed and how patterns of human land use have changed across North America and Europe. But again, that's a really coarse scale. So if you're interested in really local changes, that won't be a very helpful data set for you. Depending on where you are, different regions have done different jobs of tracking this sort of information. Some municipalities are really good, have a lot of detailed land use information for the last like couple of decades. Some regions as well have different universities or institutions or others that have been kind of developing this sort of information as well. So it's unfortunately, a really regionally specific case-by-case thing. And it just takes a little bit of research to look at what's available for where you are.
All right, it looks like we have time for just one more question, and I believe it is specific regionally to Canada. And they're interested about Sudbury, I hope I'm saying that right, has such a large area of KBA, and do you know what's driving that for that area?
Oh, that's interesting. Has a area of KBA or IBA maybe? Not sure. I grew up near Sudbury. I grew up in North Bay, so shout out 705 Northern Ontario. That's a really good question, and please reach out. I'd be happy to chat more about this. I'll say we're identifying these KBAs in a regional way, and so the work in Ontario that we're doing is really just getting started over the last couple of months, and it's very much where people are really excited. We're identifying KBAs there really quickly. So I'll have to look up to see exactly what's going on near Sudbury. But it's possible that there was already an important bird area that was near there, or a few, because maybe that's the migration pathway of a lot of birds. I'm not sure, but it could just be that there's a lot of interested people that are helping us out with that program in that area, and so we're doing a really good job at really quickly identifying potential places for these key biodiversity areas. Incidentally, if you visit our website, kbacanada.org, you can find a map of where we have identified all the KBAs so far. And so you can zoom in, on your area around Sudbury and see exactly how many KBAs we have identified there so far. But please reach out. I'd love to chat more to you about what's going on.
All right, well, that is all the time we have today. Thank you so much, Peter, for being here. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for participating and asking such great questions. Please feel free to reach out to Peter, reach out to us for additional resources. And I will be sure to have a few links in that email that will go out after this webinar. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And thanks everyone for coming.